Hey everyone, in this video I want to cover two topics. The first is importing content from a QTI file, a export file for a test bank, or maybe your publisher's a quiz file that they give you. I'm going to import those in as a classic question bank, create a quiz from those, and then show you how to migrate that quiz over to a new quiz. I'll talk a little bit about the pros and cons of that as I go through it, but typically, I go to the home page and import existing content, and sometimes I have to kind of test which type this is. But your test bank should usually tell you: is it a QTI file? Is it a Blackboard file? Maybe it's quizzes specifically for Canvas. So most common ones that I use are the QTI and the Blackboard, and they seem to be relatively interchangeable. That format is kind of the default for Blackboard anyway. So a lot of times you'll look down here. I have a bunch of that are imported as Blackboard Learn, the 6, 7, 8, 9, or in some cases QTI files. I typically try to go with the QTI file if I can, and I'm going to choose it. It's not going to show as a QTI file. Whenever you get an export, it's just a zip file. So I'm going to grab this Business 303 test as an example. Now, I'm going to tell it to create a new question bank. I'm going to call it importing example, but most of the time, these files have a bank name built into them, but I'm going to show you how to check to see, etc. I am not going to import this as a new quiz. I have not found that this is working correctly yet, so I'm just importing this as a new question bank. I've selected the QTI file. Gonna let it go, and a lot of people, their first mistake is assuming that this is going to create a quiz. I'll go over to quizzes, and I'm going to delete two of these. These are not ones that came in, but this did not create a quiz. Instead, this created a question bank. So I am going to create a classic quiz. I'm going to call it importing example test, and I'm going to jump over to the questions and hit the find questions to show you one thing that happened. If you remember, I called it an importing example. There's no question bank here. And if I view the course question banks, I will actually see that the one I just imported had a name built in, and it grabbed that. So notice today is October 10th. So this is the example that it created. I'm just going to rename this so that I can keep it straight. Importing example. I recommend naming things with the course that you have here. You'll notice a couple that I've helped other people with. As you import it, give it that name. That might become more obvious later on why to do that. So I'm going to rename this thing, and I'm going to go back over to my quiz here, my exporting example test questions. And because I'm going to not just create a test here, I'm actually going to import this. I'm going to do something that might seem a little strange. I'm going to create a new question group, and I'm going to call it importing questions migration. Normally, I name this, EDU 101 Chapter 4, and I do all of my quizzes by content, like chapters, so that I can reuse them later. I'm not going to link it to a question bank. I'm just going to hit the Create Group, and then I'm going to click the Find Questions, and I'm going to go to that example I just renamed, and I'm going to select all the questions that I just imported, and I'm going to add them to that group. So now I have a group of questions, right? All the questions that were on that test are now in this question group. The reason I do that is because of how the tests migrate into item banks in the new quizzes. Otherwise, if you were just using classic quizzes, you could write the test using the find questions. You could have specific ones. If you wanted to use random questions, that's what this group does. It allows you to say, like, hey, I want you to pick 10 questions worth 1 point per question, and it's going to pick 10 of these questions that are in the group. But I'm going to migrate this over to show you how that works as well. So I'm going to go back to the details, and I am going to save this thing. and jump back over to my quizzes. So I've just imported 50 questions into this importing example test. I put them all in a group, and it's right now picking 10 of those questions randomly. The nice thing is migrating is pretty simple. The key to remember when you're migrating is that it's only going to migrate the questions physically on that test. It doesn't migrate the question bank, which is why typically I take all of the questions, put them into a group, and you can do multiple groups at once, and I'll say like this is the chapter 3 group, the chapter 4 group, the chapter 5 group, and I'll migrate that test over to the new test. The reason that some people will migrate tests is a new test has the ability to go in and say this test is worth 23 points, even though it has 50 questions on it. You can't do that in the old tests, like the classic ones. If you edit a classic test, you can't change how many points it's worth. You'd actually have to go into each question, and if you wanted this to be 10 questions worth 15 points, you'd have to revalue every question in that bank. And that can be very tedious, so I use new questions as an example for that. The pro for the classic quizzes, although I have not tested this yet, is that classic quizzes might let you grade essay questions one question at a time. So there is that. So right now, I'm just going to pause and wait for this migrating to finish. All right, and once that migration has finished, since I'm not going to use the classic quiz, I usually delete that right away. And I want to show you this example test that is now here. If I click on the new example test and I go to the build section, here's where I will see how this test is currently laid out. And it's a little bit different format, but you will see that there is a question bank being used here, and it's pulling 10 questions from it, and you'll see there's my questions 1 through 10. I also want to point out that if you click on the item banks, you'll see that the item banks are here. This is why I usually name them something like this, so I can tell the difference, especially if I'm looking at all the item banks. And just remember, item banks are new quizzes. If I wanted to just create a quiz with specific questions, I can insert content with that plus menu, and here's my item banks, and I will just go to the ones in this course and pick that one. I could add all the questions, which allows me to select how many at random, or I could just add specific questions using the plus menus down here, and that's just going to add that individual question on there. Now, I wouldn't recommend doing a mixture of these because these are part of the item bank, and it's going to possibly randomly pick one of those. But the reason I move everything over is I tend to, if you look at some of these item banks, if I go to all banks and just search edu, you'll see I have mine edu chapter 653, chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. so that I can create quizzes based on the chapters as I go through there. So I do that. It's not necessary to create it that way. But hopefully that helps you as you import something into the course. It's just where you would go when you copy the course and you import it. Just remember that by default, unless you've selected something, it's going to import it as a classic question bank. So you need to go to the quiz area, create a classic quiz, and if you want to import it right away or migrate it right away, that's great. You can create the classic quiz, find the questions, use the banks. Remember to check out the name so that you know you're using the correct bank. Once you have it created, you can migrate that quiz. Just remember, it's only going to migrate all of the questions that are on that quiz. If you want it to migrate and have a question bank, put them all in a group, name that group, migrate it over. You can rename that item bank in the future. It's a little convoluted right now, and I do wish that it worked better to go into the manage question banks and to import questions or add questions into a question bank from here. You'll notice a lot of times there, in some places you might find somewhere where you can actually add questions individually, or in some cases import questions, but we've really not found that that has been working well throughout. I'm sure it'll get fixed in the future and updated as we move along. But hopefully that gets you started. If you have any questions, please let me know.